Chapter 3. Iraq Star Follower, wolf ship captain and one of the senior war jarls of the Skandians, made his way through the low-ceilinged, wood-panelled lodge to the great hall. His face was marked with a frown as he went. He had plenty to do, with the spring raiding season coming on. His ship needed repairs and refitting. Most of all, it needed the fine-tuning that only a few days at sea could bring. Now this summons from Ragnak boded ill for his plans, particularly since the summons had come through the medium of Borsa, the Oberjarl's Hilfman, or administrator. If Borsa were involved, it usually meant that Ragnak had some little task for Iraq to look after, or some not-so-little task, the wolf ship skipper thought wryly. Breakfast was long since finished, so there were only a few servants clearing up the hall when he arrived. At the far end, seated at a rough pine table off to one side of Ragnak's high seat, a massive pinewood chair that served in place of a throne for the Skandian ruler, Ragnak and Borsa sat, their heads bowed over a pile of parchment scrolls. Iraq recognized those scrolls. They were the tax returns for the various towns and shires throughout Skandia. Ragnak was obsessed with them. As for Borsa, his life was totally dominated by them. He breathed, slept, and dreamed the tax returns, and woe betide any local jarl who might try to shortchange Ragnak or claim any deduction that wouldn't pass Borsa's fine-toothed comb inspection. Iraq put two and two together and sighed quietly. The most likely conclusion that he could draw from the two facts of his summoning and the pile of tax returns on the table was that he was about to be sent off on another tax-collecting mission. Tax collecting was not something that Iraq enjoyed. He was a raider and a sea-wolf, a pirate and a fighter. As such, his inclination was to be more on the side of the tax evaders than the Oberjarl and his eager-fingered Hilfman. Unfortunately, on those previous occasions when Iraq had been sent out to collect overdue or unpaid taxes, he had been too successful for his own good. Now, whenever there was the slightest doubt about the amount of tax owing from a village or a shire, Borsa automatically thought of Iraq as the solution to the problem. To make matters worse, Iraq's attitude and approach to the job only added to his desirability in Borsa's and Ragnak's eyes. Bored with the task and considering it embarrassing and belittling, he made sure he spent as little time on the job as possible. Not for him the tortuous arguments and recalculation of amounts owing after all deductions had been approved and agreed. Iraq opted for a more direct course, which consisted of seizing the person under investigation, ramming a double-headed broadaxe up under his chin, and threatening mayhem if all taxes, every single one of them, were not paid immediately. Iraq's reputation as a fighter was well known throughout Skandia. To his annoyance, he was never asked to make good on his threat. Those recalcitrants whom he visited invariably coughed up the due amount, and often a little extra that had never been in contention without the slightest argument or hesitation. The two men at the table looked up as he made his way through the benches towards the end of the room. The great hall served more than one purpose. It was where Ragnak and his close followers took their meals. It was also the site of all banquets and official gatherings in Skandia's rough-and-ready social calendar. And the small open annex where Ragnak and Borsa were currently studying tax returns was also Ragnak's office. It wasn't particularly private, since any member of the inner or outer council of jarls had access to the hall at any time of day. But then, Ragnak wasn't the sort to need privacy. He ruled openly and made all his policy statements to the world at large. "Ah, Iraq, you're here," said Borsa, and Irak thought, not for the first time, that the Hilfman had a habit of stating the bleeding obvious. "Who is it this time?" he asked in a resigned tone. He knew there was no use trying to argue his way out of the assignment, so he might as well just get on with it. With luck, it would be one of the small towns down the coast, and at least he might have a chance to work up his crew and wolfship at the same time. Ostkrag, the Oberjarl told him, and Irak's hopes of salvaging something useful from this assignment faded to nothing. Ostkrag lay far inland to the east. It was a small settlement on the far side of the mountain range that formed the rugged spine of Skandia, and was accessible only by going over the mountains themselves, or through one of the half-dozen tortuous passes that wound their way through. At best, it meant an uncomfortable journey there and back by pony, a method of transport that Irak loathed. As he thought of the mountain range that reared above Hallersholm, he had a quick memory of the 2 Araluen slaves he had helped escape several months ago. He wondered what had become of them, whether they had made it to the small hunting cabin high in the mountains, and whether they had survived the last months of winter. He realized abruptly that Borsa and Ragnak were both waiting for his reaction. "Ostkrag," he repeated. Ragnak nodded impatiently. "Their quarterly payment is overdue. I want you to go and shake them up," the Oberjarl said. Irak noticed that Ragnak couldn't quite hide the avaricious gleam that came into his eyes whenever he talked about tax and payments. Irak couldn't help giving vent to an exasperated sigh. "They can't be overdue by more than a week or so," he temporized, but Ragnak was not to be swayed and shook his head violently. 10 days, he snapped, and it's not the first time. I've warned them before, haven't I, Borsa? He said, turning to the Hilfman, who nodded. The Jarl at Ostkrag is Sten Hammerhand, Borsa said, as if that were explanation enough. Irak stared blankly at him. He should be called Sten Gluhand, he elaborated with heavy sarcasm. The tax payments have stuck to his fingers before this, and even when they're paid in full, he always makes us wait long past the overdue date. It's time we taught him a lesson. Irak smiled with some irony at the small, sparsely muscled Hilfman. Borsa could be an extremely threatening figure, he thought, when someone else was available to carry out the threats. You mean it's time I taught him a lesson, he suggested. But Borsa didn't notice the sarcasm in his voice. Exactly, he said with some satisfaction. Ragnak, however, was a little more perceptive. It's my money after all, Irak, he said, and there was a note in his voice that was almost petulant. Irak met his gaze steadily. For the first time, he realized that Ragnak was growing old. The once flaming red hair was duller and turning grey. It came as a surprise to Irak. He certainly didn't feel that he was growing older, yet Ragnak didn't have too many years on him. He could notice other changes in the Oberjarl, now that he had become aware of the fact. The hair was greying, the jowls were heavier, and the waistline thickening. He wondered if he was changing too, but then dismissed the notion. He had marked no dramatic changes in his own face, and he studied it each morning in his burnished metal mirror. He decided it must be due to the pressures of being Oberjarl. It's been a severe winter, he suggested. Perhaps the passes are still blocked. There was a lot of late snow. He moved to the large scale map of Skandia that was displayed on the wall behind Ragnak's table. He found Ostkrag and, with one forefinger, traced the way to the closest pass. The Serpent Pass, he said almost to himself. It's not impossible that all the late season snow and the sudden thaw could have led to landslides in there. He turned back to Ragnak and Borsa, indicating the position on the map to them. Maybe the couriers simply can't get through yet, he suggested. Ragnak shook his head, and again Irak sensed that irritability, the irrational annoyance that seemed to grip Ragnak these days whenever his will was thwarted or his judgment questioned. It's Sten, I know it, he said stubbornly. If it were anyone else, I might agree with you, Irak. Irak nodded, knowing full well that the words were a lie. Ragnak rarely agreed with anyone if it meant changing his own position. Get up there and get the money from him. If he argues, arrest him and bring him back. In fact, arrest him even if he doesn't argue. Take 20 men with you. I want him to see a real show of strength. I'm sick of being taken for a fool by these petty jarls. Irak looked up in some surprise. Arresting a jarl in his own lodge was not something to be lightly contemplated, particularly for such a petty offence as a late tax payment. Among the Skandians, tax evasion was considered to be almost obligatory. It was a form of sport. If you were caught out, you paid up, and that was the end of it. Irak could not remember anyone being submitted to the shame of arrest on that count. Skandians were a free-spirited people, independent and proud of the fact, and a jarl's followers held loyalty to their immediate superior to be more important than their allegiance to the central lodge where Ragnak held sway. That might not be wise, he said quietly, and Ragnak glared up at him, his eyes searching for Irak's over the scattered accounts on the table before him. I'll decide what's wise, he grated. I'm Oberjarl, not you. The words were offensive. Irak was a senior jarl, and by long-established custom he was entitled to air his opinion, even though it might be contrary to his leaders. He bit back the angry retort that sprang to his lips. There was no point provoking Ragnak any further when he was in this mood. I know you're the Oberjarl, Ragnak, he said quietly, but Sten is a jarl in his own right, and he may well have a perfectly valid reason for this late payment. To arrest him in these circumstances would be unnecessarily provocative. I'm telling you, he won't have what you call a valid reason, damn it. Ragnak's eyes were narrowed now, and his face was suffused with his anger. He's a thief and a holdout, and he needs to be made an example to the others. Ragnak, Irak began, trying to reason one last time. This time, it was Borsa who interrupted. Jarl Irak, you have your instructions. Now do as you're ordered, he shouted, and Irak turned angrily to face him. I follow the Oberjarl's orders, Hilfman, not yours. Borsa realized his mistake. He backed away a pace or two, making sure the substantial bulk of the table was between him and Irak. His eyes slid away from the other man's, and there was an ugly silence. Finally, Ragnak seemed to realize that some form of back-down might be necessary, although not too much. He said in an irritated tone, Look, Irak, just go and get those taxes from Sten. If he's been holding out on purpose, bring him back here for trial, all right? And if he has a valid reason, Irak insisted. The Oberjarl waved a hand in surrender. If he has a valid reason, you can leave him alone. Does that suit you? Irak nodded. Under those conditions, all right, he agreed. Ragnak, who never knew when to let a matter drop, replied sarcastically, Oh, really? Well, that is good of you, Jarl Irak. Now, will you get on your way before it's high summer? Irak nodded stiffly and turned away. He had the loophole he'd been looking for. As far as he was concerned, the fact that Ragnak was an insufferable pain in the buttocks was more than a valid reason for not paying taxes on time. Mind you, he might have to find another way of phrasing it when he returned, without arresting Sten.